Welcome everyone, Questini here with the discussion about the Legendary Lords of Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Arriving at C tier, we start off with Grombrindle. Now Grombrindle could be considered an S tier Legendary Lord in isolation, but the problem is he's still a Dwarf Legendary Lord, and Dwarves are just a really bad race. But Grombrindle is a good Lord, he's just a really good Lord for a really bad race. You can enjoy his campaign in the short term, where his personal effects, the Living Ancestor effects, really make that campaign work. But in the long term, he's actually going to have a lot of issues because of his isolation, geographic isolation compared to his fellow Dwarves. And as I said, the Dwarves are just limited economy, issues of recruitment, issues with armies, and so on and so forth, issues with grudges. Though Grombrindle, when Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires came out, was actually the most playable dwarf back when the beta came out of Immortal Empires specifically, where the grudges would just increase the severity by quite a lot very quickly. By the way, Grombrindle is a good lord for a poor race. Then we have the Cult of Sotic, or Tenuan, over here. Now, the Lizardmen, not that great of a race, in a similar vein to Grombrindle. Though, to be fair, they are better than Dwarves, but Grombrindle is just a better lord over here. But still, the Cult of Sotic does get significant faction effects through the sacrifices that they do make. He's not the best in combat, or really the best lord in general, but the faction effects do make this campaign work quite a bit well. Bit of a disappointment having to deal with really significant Saurus upkeep from the start, and not even having Saurus at the start, especially since you start very close to Lord Scroll, where, yeah, kind of having Saurus there from the very start would have made a world of difference in this particular campaign. But outside of that particular problem in the campaign, the Cult of Sotic is certainly a powerful faction to play for the Lizardmen. Just limitations early on in campaign, kind of a bit of a difficult start, and you're also going to have to jump in to the Southern Castways to go save Axiatl. But if you do manage that, if you do manage the Lustrian situation, it can work out pretty well. If basically you win all of the early game and mid game, you can have a decent campaign. Yeah, that's why he's C tier. Then Boris Ursus. Like, I think Boris Ursus is a formidable Legendary Lord, but like Grombrindle, he's a formidable Legendary Lord for a pretty poor race. He has one of the best starring armies in the entire game flat out, like with 2 Bear Riders, 2 Tsargar, 2 Armored Cossars, a Priest, so he's off to a great start. His starting position sucks, but really, if it was just starting position, Lord defects and all that, yeah, then Boris Ursus could be considered A tier, maybe even a bit higher than that. But Kislev is still a pretty crappy race, similar to the Dwarves. Well, not quite as bad as the Dwarves, but Boris Ursus is not quite as powerful as Grombrindle. And Kislev does have a lot of issues in their campaign at the moment. The Boris Ursus is the best Kislev Legendary Lord by far. Like, if you're going to play a Kislev campaign, my recommendation is unlock Boris Ursus from mod or for Realms of Chaos. I've done a whole guide on that. And then play his campaign in Immortal Empires. It will end up being far better than playing either Castaltin or Katrin at the moment. Then we have Crocgar. I mean, not much really to say about Crocgar. He's not completely terrible. He has a pretty decent campaign, but like, I guess you could say he's close to being a generic Legendary Lord for the Lizardmen, because he was one of the 2 launch Legendary Lords, and Mazmundi was like just like the special caster Lord, and I think Crocgar kind of ended up filling the role of like the kind of generic Lord, because he's basically a buffed up Saurus Lord, and he does have benefits for Saurus. His campaign works, minus the whole, yeah, let's go to the Siren Castways to have to deal with Kairos. That is fun. Not really. But outside of that particular problem in his campaign, it is actually a pretty functional campaign. Problem is, with Lizardmen, it's not really an issue of the Legendary Lord in this case. It's more of an issue like he's not offering anything special or special enough to overcome the major disadvantages that the Lizardmen race do have. Then we have Cetra, the Imperishable. Cetra has a brutal early game campaign, and if you do overcome that, if you do endure past like 15 turns to get the second army, if you do get to a higher level settlement, if you deal with Scarbrand, if you deal with Harkonnen, if you deal with Manfred, basically, if you deal with all the early game, you can start steamrolling the campaign because that's how the Tomb Kings are designed. The problem with Cetra is not necessarily his lord defects, his campaign power. Like, his starting position is pretty terrible. Let's be clear on that. It's a great province, but it's very exposed on all sides. But the issue with Cetra is like the Tomb Kings right now, between the Books of Nagash, the limited armies for a good amount of turns, they just end up suffering significantly in their campaigns. So it's not really a case like, oh, Cetra is a bad lord. No, Cetra is a good lord, but he's not so good enough to elevate his race in the portion of the game that does actually matter, which is the early game for the Tomb Kings. Because mid-late game, Tomb Kings are not going to have an issue. If you do have an issue in a Tomb King campaign past the mid-game, like once you've got the multiple armies, then that campaign is utter rubbish. Cetra doesn't have an utter rubbish campaign, but in the mid-late game, but he does have a pretty awful early game campaign. Then we have Malagor of the Beastmen. The Beastmen, like all the Beastmen Legionary Lords, are kind of in the same boat with the exception of Tarax. And the only reason Tarax is a bit above them is because Tarax just steamrolls with the unlimited movement points that he does get, or relatively unlimited. There is a limit to how much you can go, but you can get you can cover a significant distance if you're playing as Tarax. As Malagor, you're kind of like in the safe starting position, comfortable starting position where you don't have any major opponent that's gonna threaten you really, so you can spend your time building up dread. Like, it's actually very difficult to attack his location where he starts, unless you're like your dwarf or greenskin or Skaven. Like, if you can't use the Underway, it's actually fairly difficult for his initial Hearthstone to be attacked. And while the Beastmen early game armies are pretty bad, he will certainly annihilate the zombies and the top knots, the savage orcs that he starts at war with. And then he gets a major dread benefit to heroes, which is actually pretty good for the Beastmen. Then we have Khalda. Her starting position is much better than Cetra, though she likely will end up in a war with Forik pretty quickly. And while Forik is not the great Legendary Lord to play at the moment, he certainly is able to build up a pretty formidable army that will pose a significant challenge in your campaign. Like, I would say her biggest issue is really that you know, she should ally Forik, but right now you're kind of in the situation where you have to fight the war with Forik, a pretty pointless war, I might add, for a Book of Nagash. Like, you could avoid it, you could take your time, you could build up, etc., etc., and then deal with Forik, deal with the Skaven, make an alliance maybe with Crocgar, make that work, go deal with Quake. It is a campaign that works. It's not as terrible as Cetra, but she's not as good in the late game as Cetra is either. And besides, she's not as cool as Cetra either. Then we have Mogor. Now, Mogor, like Malagor, starts in a fairly comfortable position, though he can be attacked pretty early on in his campaign. Like, his initial Hearthstone can be attacked pretty early on in his campaign, so you need to be a bit careful about that. But he does get this cast spawn unit capacity benefit, which is actually a pretty significant early game benefit in his campaign. The downside, I would say, in Mogor's campaign is like the others just have better faction effects. While they might have more difficult campaigns overall, like Tarax has a much more difficult early game than Mogor, I would say Tarax has a lot more late game potential than Mogor in a particular in a campaign. Then we have Nakai. Nakai can be great if you're interested in playing a campaign with just like one army, because multiple armies for Nakai won't work very well, and there's going to be quite a few issues with expanding across a vast array of territory as Nakai. You might be surprised, but you are playing a horde army and it is vulnerable to destruction. You are going to have limited armies. Your income is tied to basically the garrisons that you're building up as you're taking over settlements. There are quite a few benefits. I'm not saying it can't be a fun campaign, but it is still a limited campaign that didn't necessarily make that much sense. Even Warhammer 2 doesn't necessarily work that well. Like, look at Nakai's situation. They literally had to shove him in a corner for his campaign to work in anyway. Yeah, that's not a great Legendary Lord. Like, when you literally get shoved in a superb starting position and you still have problems, yeah, it's not a great campaign. And then finally, we have Cataract the One-Eye. Now, Cataract actually has quite a bit of potential. He can build up a significant amount of Marks of Ruination. He can build up a lot of Dread. He has the hardest turn one start of any Beastman campaign. Because he does have to attack a Wood Elven settlement. He has to fight a field battle, then the settlement battle is pretty brutal. I'm not going to lie about that. But at the same time, when you're looking at Cataract, like if you overcome that and you have Karl Franz trying to attack you again and again and again and just losing armies, you build Marks of Ruination pretty quickly in this campaign, and you do start steamrolling with that. Like that, this is the norm though for the Beastmen. But like I would say, when it comes to like a full long Beastman campaign, it's like the others are just much better suited for it. I mean, Cataract isn't bad because of his he's not bad at all, but I think Mandalore Gaming put it the best. He's the campaign you might play when you're learning to play Beastman. He's not the campaign you play once you figure out how to play Beastman. Though in Warhammer 3, he's probably the worst to start to learn Beastman. Like I would say Mogor. Like if you're a new player trying to figure out Beastman, maybe Mogor or Malagor would be a much better fit for that. Not poor Cataract, really. Not poor Cataract, because yeah, it is a pretty difficult turn one situation to deal with in that campaign. And that is it for the C rating. Not necessarily as many Legendary Lords in this tier as there are in all the others, basically. Not as densely populated, though it is the same number of Legendary Lords as in S tier, though. Well, stay tuned for more, because there's going to be quite a few more in D and especially in F. Oh yes, in F.